Hello, and welcome to a lecture on the integumentary system, also known as skin. In this lecture, I'll start off by talking about the functions of the integument. Integument is also known as skin, which is also known as the cutaneous membrane. I'll talk about the two layers, or the two primary layers to skin, which are the epidermis and dermis. I'll spend some time talking about the accessory structures of skin, which are things like glands and hair. And then I'll talk a little bit about a layer that's below the dermis, and it's called the subcutaneous layer or the hypodermis. But first, let's start off by talking about the functions of skin, or functions of the integumentary system, if you will. So all these things listed here are functions of the integumentary system. The integumentary system does protect us. It obviously keeps the inside stuff in and the outside stuff out. You know, our skin helps to do things like keep pathogens from getting into our body, for example, or harmful chemicals, or even things like UV radiation. Also, the integumentary system helps to protect us from losing things from our body, like water. When someone has severe skin burns, one of the primary medical concerns is dehydration due to the water loss through the absence of skin. Another function of the integumentary system is excretion. The skin does excrete some compounds through sweat. So sweat is mostly made of water, but there's also salts in sweat. And there can be some urea in sweat too. And urea is more commonly found in urine, but it can also be found in sweat. The integumentary system does help to regulate. By this I mean it helps us to regulate body temperature. One of the ways that we can cool the body when it's very warm is to dilate blood vessels in the skin. And when we dilate blood vessels in the skin, our very warm blood can get closer to the surface of our body, and now it's easier for the heat to dissipate away from the blood and into the external environment. Likewise, when our body temperature is dropping, we can constrict those blood vessels and bring them closer to the inside of our body and keep them warm and don't lose heat that way. The integumentary system synthesizes. By that I mean that it makes something that our body uses. And it happens that skin makes a vitamin called vitamin D. And vitamin D helps us to absorb calcium in the small intestine. And the integumentary system stores, and by that I mean that it's able to store fat. In the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer, we have quite a bit of fat that is storing lipids for energy. And the integumentary system detects. The integumentary system helps us to detect touch, for example, or pain, or things that are warm or cold. Now, these are just a few examples. There are several other things that the integumentary system does, but these are the basics of the functions of skin. So here is an artist's rendition of skin, right? And you can see the surface here with the hair projecting off the surface, right? And you notice there's a lot of stuff going on in here, right? We have this pink layer with lots of stuff. And down at the bottom we have a layer that kind of looks like corn pops almost, all these little yellow bits. The outermost layer of skin is the epidermis. So this is the tan and blue colored layer in the picture. The pink layer here is called the dermis, and the layer with the fat that looks like the corn pops is the subcutaneous layer. The two primary layers to skin are the epidermis and the dermis. The hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer, is considered a secondary layer to skin. So the epidermis is the outermost layer. Also, we could say that this is the most superficial layer to skin. The epidermis is primarily composed of keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelial tissue. And it's almost entirely composed of one cell type, which are keratinocytes. But there are a few other cell types present there that we'll talk about later. The dermis, which is just deep to the epidermis, is composed of connective tissues. It's made primarily of just two connective tissues, areolar connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. The accessory structures of skin originate here in the dermis, but most of them extend through the dermis and through the epidermis to the surface of skin. Like, for example, the root of a hair is located in the dermis, but then the hair shaft itself will penetrate through the epidermis and out onto the surface of skin. So I'd first like to start by talking about the epidermis in more detail. In terms of its structure, the epidermis is avascular. And if you put the letter A in front of something in biology, it means not or without. Vascular means blood vessels. So the epidermis does not have any of its own blood vessels. But as you're well aware, our blood vessels help to carry things like oxygen and nutrients and water and to remove waste. So we still need these things to happen. So it turns out that very close by to the epidermis, there's that layer called the dermis, and the dermis does contain blood vessels, very tiny blood vessels called capillaries. And the capillaries in this nearby dermis help to bring the nutrients and oxygen that are necessary for the survival of the cells in the epidermis. The epidermis is mostly composed of stratified squamous epithelial cells. We have anywhere from 4 to 5 distinct layers of cells. We have two main types of skin, thick skin and thin skin. There would be 4 layers of epithelial cells in the epidermis in thin skin, whereas the thick skin would have the 5 layers. Thick skin is what you'd find like on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. There's other cell types that are also present in the epidermis, so it's not just epithelial cells. Things like melanocytes that produce melanin that helps to protect us from UV radiation, for example. We'll talk more about the other cells found in the epidermis in just a moment. I want to talk a little bit about bacteria because we do have bacteria that live on our epidermis. So we have bacteria that live on the outside of our skin. And we want these bacteria there. For the most part, they are helpful. And they're helpful for different reasons. One of the things is that these bacteria that live on the surface of our skin, they are taking up a space where potentially harmful bacteria could live. So if we lost this natural bacteria on the surface of our skin, then a new bacteria could move into its place, and this new bacteria could be harmful and could cause illnesses. Also, the bacteria that live on the surface of our skin help to produce something called the acid mantle of our skin, which is a slightly acidic nature to the surface of our skin, and that helps to protect us too. And I'll talk more about that later. In terms of the function of the epidermis obviously is very protective in nature, and it also does synthesize. So this is the layer of our skin that produces the vitamin D. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about the different types of cells that we can find in the epidermis. By far the majority of the cells in the epidermis are going to be keratinocytes, which are a type of epithelial cell. They're called keratinocytes because they produce the protein known as keratin. Keratin is a very strong protein which gives strength to the epidermis. Another cell type that we find in the epidermis are basal cells, which are a type of stem cell. Now, stem cells are cells in the body that can do 2 things. Number 1, they can replicate themselves, and number 2, they can differentiate or become a different cell type. So these basal cells in the epidermis of skin, they can create new keratinocytes, so they can differentiate into new keratinocytes. Melanocytes are also present in the epidermis. Melanocytes are named for the fact that they produce a pigment known as melanin, and melanin helps to protect us from UV radiation. Also in the epidermis, we have cells called Langerhans cells. These are also known as dendritic cells. And these are a type of defensive cell, so they can detect pathogens, and they're very active in body defense. And we might also have a small number of sensory cells located in the epidermis. Now, most of our sensory cells are actually going to be located in the dermis. So when we use the skin to sense something like temperature, pain, touch, that sort of thing, most of those sensory cells are located in that deeper layer called the dermis. But we do have a small number of sensory cells located in the epidermis. So we do have some pain receptors called nociceptors there. We do have some Merkel cells, that type of thing. A little bit more on the keratinocytes that we find in the epidermis. So, as I said before, the keratinocytes are the most abundant. In this picture here, this is the epidermis, and this is the dermis down here, so we're going to ignore the dermis, right? And the purple cells, I guess some more pink, the purple and pink cells in the picture here are the keratinocytes. And they produce the protein called keratin, which is very strong. It makes the epidermis very strong. The keratinocytes arise at the bottom layer of the epidermis, so right near the dermis, and then they're pushed towards the superficial surface. They arise from the basal cells. So this yellow cell right here, where you can see a nice mitotic spindle, this is a basal cell, a stem cell, and it is capable of producing new keratinocytes. And whenever we make new keratinocytes here at the base of the epidermis, these other cells will be pushed towards the apex, towards the superficial surface. Once a keratinocyte makes its way to the apex, it's dead. So the keratinocytes on the apex of our skin are very much dead. They're basically just cell membranes with lots of keratin protein in them. The cell membranes help to create a waterproof barrier, and that's really important because, again, it helps to keep the water in our body so that we don't dehydrate. Also, the keratin, as I mentioned, is a rather strong protein which lends strength to that epidermis. The keratinocytes, oddly enough, contain the pigment melanin. And as I mentioned before, melanin is a pigment that helps protect us from UV radiation, which comes from the sun. What's kind of interesting is that the keratinocytes themselves don't make melanin. They are given the melanin. So there are other cells in the epidermis. This one right here, this is a melanocyte. There are other cells like these melanocytes in the epidermis that give melanin to the keratinocytes. I'll talk more about that in a minute. It takes anywhere from about a half a month to a full month, so 15 to 30 days, for a keratinocyte to migrate from the base of the epidermis to the apex. So basically, you replace your entire epidermis once a month. Now, a little bit more on those melanocytes that I mentioned. Melanocytes, like keratinocytes, are found in the epidermis. And the melanocytes are very important because they produce melanin, which helps to protect from UV radiation. Melanin is a pigment, so that means that it attracts light. It's a pigment that is based off of the amino acid tyrosine. And I know everyone loves their organic chemistry structures, so this is what melanin looks like. It turns out that melanocytes really produce two types of melanin, eumelanin and pheomelanin. The prefix EU means true, and the prefix pheo means false. So basically, there's a true melanin and a false melanin. The eumelanin tends to be dark brown, black in color, whereas the pheomelanin is much lighter, red to orange kind of color. Melanin's job is to protect the skin from ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And this is important because the melanin helps to prevent cancers then, because UV radiation, if it hits our DNA, it can actually cause DNA mutations which can lead to cancers. And these melanocytes are rather unusual looking cells. They kind of look like an octopus or a squid or something. They have these long arm-like projections. And inside the arm-like projections, they contain melanin, that pigment. And if you notice here, what's happening is little bits of the arm kind of blip off and go to neighboring cells. And this little bud that has come off of the melanocyte, this bud is called a melanosome. It's basically a vesicle that's broken away from the melanocyte. And this vesicle, the melanosome, is transferred to the neighboring keratinocytes so that the melanocyte can actually share the protective melanin with its neighbors. So this is a rather nice and sharing kind of cell. The melanocyte is not only itself protecting us from UV radiation and cancer, but it's also spreading its protective compounds to the neighboring cells, helping to protect them too. So oftentimes the melanin from the melanosomes will end up on the sunny side of the nucleus of the keratinocytes in order to protect that nucleus and its DNA from UV damage. I want to talk a little bit about what causes melanin production, also known as melanogenesis. So melanogenesis is stimulated by many things, including exposure to UV radiation. Most of us are aware of tanning. So tanning is a darkening of the skin that occurs in response to UV radiation exposure. So UV radiation exposure increases melanin production or melanogenesis through different mechanisms. UV radiation, increases the production of enzymes that help us to make melanin. UVR also causes several different cell types in the body to produce a hormone called MSH, which is known as melanocyte stimulating hormone. So, for example, keratinocytes, when they're exposed to UV radiation, they will produce MSH. MSH itself can increase melanogenesis. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. UV radiation exposure also can increase the number of receptors for melanocyte stimulating hormone. So MSH is a hormone, which means it's a chemical messenger. And chemical messengers bind to receptors on their target cells. And once the chemical messenger binds to the receptor, some sort of change happens in that receiving cell. So the receptors for MSH are called MC1R receptors. And so when a melanocyte is exposed to UV radiation, it produces more receptors for the melanocyte stimulating hormone. So I want to talk a little bit more about that hormone. So MSH binds to the MC1R receptor. And when this happens, ultimately it causes an increase in the more protective type of melanin, which is the eumelanin. So the eumelanin, that darker melanin, is much more protective against UV radiation than the pheomelanin. And when MSH binds to the MC1R receptor, we produce more eumelanin and not so much of the pheomelanin. So if someone lacks MSH or lacks a receptor for MSH, usually only the pheomelanin is produced. So to kind of explain this further, I have a little animation I want to show you. So this sort of blue background is supposed to be our melanocyte, okay? And this is the MC1R receptor. So this is the receptor that binds to the MSH hormone. And this over here, this is supposed to be melanin. So here we have some sunlight, so we've been exposed to UV radiation. And as I mentioned before, UV radiation will increase the production of MSH. So keratinocytes in the neighboring area, for example, might produce MSH. MSH is a hormone that binds to a receptor, the MC1R receptor. Once the hormone and receptor come together, a series of changes will occur inside the melanocytes. And ultimately what happens is that the melanocyte starts to make more eumelanin. And again, that's to protect from the damaging UV radiation. But now let's take a look at what happens if we have, for example, a broken receptor for MSH. So in this particular example, the MC1R receptor is not working properly. So again, we start off with some exposure to UV radiation. Okay? So keratinocytes in the area produce MSH, but what just happened there? Let's look at that again. How come the MSH is not binding to the receptor? Well, I just said the receptor is broken here, right? So now we can't produce that eumelanin. And basically the melanocyte goes into a more of a default program and produces the less protective pheomelanin. I want to talk a little bit more about skin color. Now, skin color is determined by both genetics and the environment. For example, the amount of UV radiation you're exposed to will determine your skin color. So, again, referring to the tanning effect there. And that's actually the technical name for it, by the way. There is an even more technical name, but in the literature they often refer to it as the tanning effect. Another thing that determines skin color is the amount of melanin someone produces and the type of melanin that they produce. What I find kind of interesting is when they first started to study skin color, and they were looking at epidermal samples from both dark-skinned and light-skinned individuals. Originally, the scientists hypothesized that dark-skinned individuals would have more melanocytes. But what they found out in their studies is that really everyone has the same number of melanocytes. It's really the amount and types of melanin being produced by the melanocytes that are different. So some individuals produce a lot of that eumelanin, which would make darker skin. Some individuals don't make any eumelanin, they only make the pheomelanin, which would produce very light-colored skin with red and orange kind of pigments. And I just realized now that I have two number 2s on here, so forgive me. But the second number 2 says distribution of melanin. The distribution of melanin can contribute to skin color. For example, freckling. Right? In freckling, some individuals are producing melanin in patches, so lots of melanin here, not so much there, a little bit more melanin here, not so much there. And the presence or absence of other pigments can contribute to skin color too. For example, someone that has very light skin and lots of blood vessels in their skin might have a redder tone to their skin. You know, that's me, for example. I have highly vascularized light skin, and I often appear red. I mean, when I'm exercising, I look like a tomato. It's very, very lovely. And that's due to the hemoglobin, which contains iron, and hemoglobin and iron in our blood create a red color. Some individuals have a genetic predisposition to deposit yellow pigments into their skin, so that can create sort of a yellowing to the skin. So there are many different things that can contribute to skin color. This individual right here with the very light skin, freckles, red hair, this is very characteristic of an individual with a broken MC1R receptor. So most people that have a broken MC1R receptor have that because of a mutation in the gene for the MC1R receptor. And so this is a mutation that's handed down from parent to offspring. And it creates that very, characteristic light skin, freckling, red hair kind of thing. I got a lot of nieces and nephews that look like that kid right there. These individuals, as you may well know, do not tan. When they go out in the sun, they basically go from white to red, so they need to use lots of UV protection in the sun. Because they have broken MC1R receptors, they can't really make that eumelanin. They mostly just make the pheomelanin. You might recognize this guy right here, but maybe not because he's not wearing his makeup. He is a newscaster, I believe on Channel 4. His name is Lee Thomas, and he has a condition known as vitiligo. And in vitiligo, what's happening is that melanocytes are dying, and they're dying in patches. So some areas of the skin are unaffected, while other areas of the skin are highly affected. But if you've seen him before on TV, he wears a lot of makeup, and you can't even tell he has vitiligo unless you look at his hands, because he doesn't put the makeup on his hands. You can actually see the patchiness on his hands. Vitiligo is something that can occur with both dark-skinned and light-skinned individuals, though obviously it would be more evident in darker-skinned individuals. I love this picture down here, right? We have that dark skin contrasting with the light skin here, right? And this little baby here is an albino. And albinism is a genetic condition, and there's lots of different types of albinism, and they're all caused by different mutations in various genes that contribute to skin color. And ultimately what's happening in albinism is that there's a lack of pigmentation in the skin. And there are varying degrees of this, but that there's rarely any pigments that are deposited in the skin with albinism. So the hair also is lacking pigments too. So apparently we're having a little geography lesson here. I want to talk a little bit about human skin color and the distribution on of skin color on our planet. So take a quick look at this map here. Right? Take a look at the equator, which is right here. Right? And then take a look at our key. So the darker the color on the map, basically the darker the skin color of the individuals living in that area. So my question to you is, why is darker skin often found closest to the equator? Why is darker skin often found closest to the equator? To answer that question, let's take a look at this. So here we have a picture of the Earth, and over here in yellow we can see the angle of the sun's rays coming into Earth. And it turns out that the angle of the sun's rays, they kind of hit like spot on at the equator. So the sun's rays hit straight on at the equator. And so there's very, very strong sunlight at the equator. Lots of UV radiation at the equator, much more sun exposure at the equator. But if you go up to, like, say, the North Pole, notice the angle here is very different, right? The sun's light is coming in at quite an angle, and because of that, there's much less light that gets through, and there's much less UV radiation exposure. So it makes more sense that individuals living around the equator would need more protection from UV radiation. This is a histological slide of skin, very classic representation. You can see the shedding dead keratinocytes at the apex. Right? So this is all epidermis here, and then this is a deeper layer called the dermis. Skin cancers will be covered later. The last main topic we have here with the epidermis is talking about vitamin D. Vitamin D is produced in the epidermis, and it's made when UV radiation converts cholesterol in keratinocytes into something called cholecalciferol. So basically, sunlight comes into the keratinocytes. It hits cholesterol in the cell membranes of the keratinocytes, and the cholesterol changes from cholesterol to something called cholecalciferol. The cholecalciferol is released in the bloodstream, where it travels to the liver. The liver takes in the cholecalciferol and it converts it into something else called calcidiol. Calcidiol is then released into the bloodstream, where it travels to the kidneys, and the kidneys take in the calcidiol and convert it into something known as calcitriol. And I promise that's the end of the converting thing. So calcitriol is what we classically think of as vitamin D. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D. And in the human body, calcitriol is a hormone. It's a chemical messenger. So it's a chemical messenger that's released by the kidneys. And when calcitriol is released by the kidneys, it goes into the bloodstream, and it primarily targets your small intestines. And the function of calcitriol is to tell your small intestines to absorb more calcium. And this helps to increase your blood calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone does this too, in that it increases your blood calcium levels. Insufficient amounts of vitamin D or calcium or phosphate can cause a condition known as rickets. So in this picture here, the child in the middle is exhibiting normal growth, whereas the child to either side have rickets. Rickets manifests itself in kind of like rubbery bones, because due to the lack of either vitamin D, calcium, or phosphate, there isn't enough bone deposition going on, and the bones are kind of rubbery. In this picture here, we can actually see the series of conversions that I mentioned, right, in order to get the calcitriol. So this is cholesterol in skin, and when UV light hits the cholesterol, it converts it into this thing right here, which is the cholecalciferol. Right? So cholesterol is converted into cholecalciferol. The cholecalciferol travels to the liver, where the liver converts it into calcidiol. And then the calcidiol goes to the kidneys, and the kidneys convert the calcidiol into calcitriol. And then the kidneys release the calcitriol, where it goes to different areas of the body, but one of its main targets is the small intestine, where it helps to increase our absorption of calcium increasing our blood calcium levels, and that helps us to do things like build bone and keep our heart healthy and our nervous system healthy. All right, now we can move on to the next layer of skin, which is the dermis. Right? So this is deep to the epidermis. Epi means upon, so the epidermis is upon or on top of the dermis. The dermis itself has two main layers, or two main divisions, if you will. It has a superficial layer called the papillary layer, and that is composed of areolar tissue. And then the deeper layer to the dermis is known as the reticular layer, which does not contain reticular tissue, and I know that's confusing. It contains dense, irregular connective tissue. Let's take a look at a picture. So just this area here at the top, this is the papillary layer, right? Papillae are little projections, if you will, so hence the name papillary layer, because we can see these little fleshy projections. And the main tissue in here is going to be areolar tissue. Areolar tissue is like the glue of your body, and basically the areolar tissue is necessary to glue your epidermis to the rest of your body. Most of the dermis, though, is made of this reticular layer. Reticular in Latin means net-like, and when we look at it under the microscope, it does have sort of a net-like appearance. The type of tissue found there, though, is dense, irregular connective tissue. The dermis contains lots of blood vessels, lots of sensory receptors, and lots of accessory structures. Coming back to this picture again, when you look at the dermis, it appears very busy. There's a lot of stuff in the dermis. And if you look at the epidermis, there's not a lot of stuff there. You got a couple tubes and some hair shooting through it, but other than that, there's not a lot there other than cells. But looking at the dermis, there's a lot going on, and a lot of these are accessory structures like glands and sensory cells, hair, that sort of thing. Oops. In terms of functions, the dermis is obviously very protective, but it also is our main site for detection. So most of our cells involved with touch, for example, are located in the dermis. And also the dermis is involved with excretion because the dermis does produce sweat. I want to talk a little bit about the dermal papillae, which are those tiny little mounds of the dermis that are projecting into the epidermis. So these little bumps here, those are the dermal papillae. When you look at this picture, notice how perfectly the dermal papillae are fitting in with the epidermal ridges. So look up here and see how we have also little mound-like structures on the epidermis, right? Little mountains and valleys on the epidermis and little mountains and valleys on the dermis. And notice how when they come together, the mountains and valleys would fit perfectly together. That's really important because what that's doing is it's increasing the contact area between the epidermis and the dermis. And the more contact area you have between the epidermis and the dermis, the stronger the attachment, the stronger the connection you have. This is very much how like Velcro works. So basically, the dermal papillae and the epidermal ridges help to keep the epidermis stuck onto the dermis. In thick skin, the dermal papillae are very raised, and that produces things like fingerprints. One of the things that we're going to find in the dermis are sensory receptors. So sensory receptors could be things involved with touch, like Meissner's and Pacinian corpuscles, or they can be free nerve endings, which could be things like nociceptors that detect pain, or thermoreceptors that detect hot and cold. So just to show you a picture of some of these things here. This is one of my favorites right here, this thing that sort of looks like an onion cut in half. It's called a Pacinian corpuscle, and it's for detecting like deeper pressure. And then over here, these ones that look kind of like the Pacinian corpuscle, those are Meissner's corpuscles. And notice that they're located closer to the epidermis, so these would be more involved with lighter touch sensations. Other accessory structures we might find in the dermis include things like hair and hair follicles, sebaceous glands, sweat glands, and nails. All of these structures are rooted in the dermis. So they start in the dermis, but many of them project through to the skin surface. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on hair. In terms of human physiology, not psychology, but human physiology, hair doesn't have a whole lot of function, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Think about hair for a minute. Think about what it does for you physiologically. Right? How is it important? Can you live without hair? Yes. Right? Some hair is more important than others, like eyebrows, for example. Right? Eyebrows are very good at blocking some of the sunlight coming into our eyes. Our eyelashes are protective for keeping foreign particles from getting into our eye. But again, all of this is stuff that you could really live without. All of the human body is covered with hair, all of it. And some people it's thicker or thinner than others, or darker or lighter, but all of the human body is covered with hair except for a few places. Okay, so see if you can think of a few places on the human body where you will not find hair. A lot of people say eyelids, and that's not true actually. We do have some hair on our eyelids, right? But the palms of our hand don't have any hair, right? The lips, no hair. Soles of the feet, no hair. And some portions of the external genitalia also lack hair. Other than that, everything else has some amount of hair on it. All right, moving on to another accessory structure. I want to talk about the exocrine glands of the dermis. There are two main types of exocrine glands in the dermis. Sebaceous glands, which produce an oily type secretion, and sweat or sudoriferous glands, which of course produce sweat. One of the interesting things is that the secretions of these two glands, which are sebum and sweat, the sebum and sweat mix together on the surface of our skin and help to produce the skin's acid mantle. And I mentioned this acid mantle earlier when we talked about the bacteria on the skin, because it turns out that the bacteria on our skin also contribute to this acid mantle. So we have sebum and sweat and bacterial secretions, and they're all mixing together to produce the skin's acid mantle. So the pH of skin is slightly acidic, so it's under 7. And this is important because many pathogenic bacteria that can grow on the skin, they like to do so at a neutral pH. But by maintaining an acidic mantle on the skin, we're preventing the growth of pathogenic bacteria. And that friendly bacteria that's okay to have on the skin, that does like to grow in that acid environment. So by keeping this acid mantle, we're encouraging the keeping of our friendly skin bacteria, if you will, and we're discouraging the growth of harmful bacteria. Now, having said that, I just want to mention that this bacteria that grows on your skin that's not harmful, if it actually got into your body, it would be harmful, right? It's okay to have it on the surface of your skin. But if you were to cut your skin and the bacteria got into your body, into like your blood, for example, that could be very dangerous. So it's healthy to have it on the surface of the skin, but not in the body itself. And you can kind of think of E. coli in the large intestine kind of the same way. You know, it's good to have bacteria in our colon, right? But if we were to eat that bacteria, for example, that could make us very sick. Okay, moving on to something less gross. Well, only slightly less gross. I want to talk about sebaceous glands, which are the oil-producing glands. So this is the artist's rendition of skin, and you can see the sebaceous gland right here, the sort of bulbous structure that's attached to the hair shaft. Okay? And sebaceous glands are routinely attached to a hair shaft. These sebaceous glands produce sebum, which is mostly a lipid, mostly an oil, but it does have other compounds in there. And the sebum is produced in the gland, but it travels up the hair shaft to the surface of the skin. And then the sebum kind of spreads across the surface of the epidermis, and it helps to keep the epidermis moist so that it doesn't crack, because if it cracks, then you've created an opening for pathogens to get into the body. So it lubricates and it protects the epidermis. acne is a condition that's associated with sebaceous glands. Sometimes the sebaceous glands can become clogged, and bacteria can grow in those clogged areas, and that can produce pimples that we associate with acne. Acne is very common during puberty and during later adolescence, and that's mostly due to hormones. So the hormones that are being produced during and after puberty, these particular hormones can increase the growth and secretion of the sebaceous glands. So basically the sebaceous glands go kind of crazy, and they start making lots of cells and lots of oil, then everything kind of gets clogged up. And we stop that flow of sebum to the surface, and then that clogged area can create a situation that's ripe for bacterial growth, leading to pimples. Now, sweat glands are a little bit different. We have two types of sweat glands: the merocrine sweat glands, which are also known as eccrine sweat glands, and then there's another type called the apocrine sweat glands. I know these are very strange names, and normally I would explain why these things are named that way, but when it comes to the sweat glands, it doesn't help to understand why they were named the way they were, because some of them were named in error, let's just put it that way. The merocrine sweat glands are the type of sweat glands that actually produces sweat that cools us down. So when you think of, when you're becoming very sweaty, when you're warm, those are your merocrine sweat glands that are at work. They're widely distributed over the body surface, but they're especially concentrated in places like the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, the forehead. The merocrine sweat glands discharge sweat directly onto the skin surface, so they don't use like a hair shaft like we saw with the sebaceous gland. The merocrine sweat glands produce a type of sweat that cools us, and this is mostly made of water, but it also contains ions like sodium and chloride, and it can contain waste compounds such as urea. And of course, the function of the merocrine sweat glands is to cool the body down when it becomes excuse me. The function of the merocrine sweat glands is to cool the body down when the body becomes warm, basically by putting water onto the surface of our skin. What we can do now is use our excess body heat to vaporize that sweat. It takes a lot of energy to cause water to transition from a liquid state to a gaseous state. Think about just like if you put a pot of water to boil on the stove. How long would it take for all that water to disappear as gas, water vapor, into the atmosphere? It would take a long time, right? A lot of energy, too. Lots and lots of heat energy would be required to cause that transition from liquid to gas. So what we can do is, by putting sweat on the surface of our skin, we can use our excess body heat to vaporize that water, and in doing so, we can get rid of some of our heat. Now, the apocrine sweat glands are very different. They are mostly concentrated in the axillary region and the groin region. They are associated with hair shafts. So like a sebaceous gland, they are usually attached to a hair. They produce a really sort of sticky, cloudy secretion. And the function of the apocrine sweat is, I would like to say that it's unknown, but as of right now we say that there is no function. They think that back in the day, way back in human evolution, that perhaps the compounds in apocrine sweat could be detected by other humans, and so maybe it was used as a signaling mechanism. For example, there are compounds that are in apocrine sweat that maybe could have signaled mating and that sort of thing. Something kind of interesting about apocrine sweat is that the bacteria that live on our skin, those friendly bacteria, they love to eat your apocrine sweat. They love it. There's all kinds of nutrients in the apocrine sweat that the bacteria eat like crazy. And then when the bacteria eat the apocrine sweat, the bacteria produce a waste that does not smell very nice, which is why we can have those not so nice smells in places like the axillary region. And that's why we use things like deodorant to help combat that. And that's why, things like proper body hygiene, like showering, are very important too. That helps to control the amount of bacteria in that axillary region. So a couple pictures of the different type of sweat glands. You can see this gland here is associated with a hair shaft. So this one here is an apocrine sweat gland. This one over here, which I didn't circle, but this is a sebaceous gland that produces oil, not sweat. And over here, this looks very much like this gland here, but notice that the duct goes directly to the surface without a hair. So this would be a merocrine sweat gland. There are other types of integumentary glands associated with the dermis. For example, mammary glands in the breast produce milk, and ceruminous glands in the external ear canal produce cerumen, which is the fancy name for earwax. I want to talk a little bit about a condition known as dermatitis, right? So dermatitis is inflammation of the dermis. So if something ends in itis, it means inflammation. I don't know how much you know about inflammation, so let's talk about inflammation just a little bit. Inflammation is a protective mechanism that occurs in the body in response to often things like injury. And there are certain characteristics of inflammation. When something becomes inflamed, it is often warm to the touch. It is swollen. Sometimes you can see a color associated with it. It can be red. And it's painful or itchy. And so those are very common characteristics for anything that could become inflamed, such as a joint, for example. So like your elbow joint becomes inflamed. It's swollen, it's painful, it's red, that kind of thing. So dermatitis is inflammation of the skin. Dermatitis can be caused by lots and lots and lots of different things. Okay? Infection, radiation, mechanical irritation, chemicals, genetics. Let's look at a few examples. So I don't know if you've ever seen this before. I had this on both of my legs several summers ago, and this is poison ivy. And poison ivy is caused by a compound in the poison ivy leaf called urushiol, and urushiol causes a type of dermatitis on the skin that results in these blister-like pustules, and it itches like crazy, and it looks completely disgusting. This is psoriasis, and psoriasis is actually an overproduction of skin cells, and it's often genetic in nature. So individuals that have psoriasis often have a parent that had psoriasis too. Yeah. So what happens is the skin overproduces keratinocytes, and then because there's so many keratinocytes in the area, it causes inflammation and irritation, resulting in this patchy red pattern. I don't know if you've seen this before, right? It's not the symbol for Target, right? This is actually a characteristic of two different skin disorders. This one in particular is Lyme disease, but you can see this bullseye pattern also with ringworm. Ringworm, by the way, is caused by a fungus, not a worm. But this one here is Lyme disease, and I don't know if you know what causes Lyme disease, but it's often caused by ticks. So a tick bite, right? A tick, when it bites you, it buries its head and its mouth parts into your skin, and there are bacteria on the mouth parts of the tick, and the bacteria on the mouth parts of the tick are actually what causes the Lyme disease. And this is not anything that you want to get. Lyme disease can cause horrible, horrible, long-lasting side effects that are highly unpredictable, so you want to avoid tick bites at all costs. So these are just some different examples of dermatitis. A rug burn would be a form of mechanical irritation. That's a form of dermatitis. There's lots of different types of dermatitis. A sunburn, right, would be radiation causing dermatitis. But note specifically, it's called dermatitis because we're getting inflammation of the dermis. You can't really have inflammation of the epidermis. Inflammation requires blood vessels. During the inflammation process, what's happening is that you're getting increased blood flow to the damaged area, and the increased blood flow causes the swelling. That's characteristic of inflammation. The increased blood flow contains red blood cells, which creates the redness. And the increased blood flow contains lots of chemical reactions going on, and blood is warm, and all of that creates heat, which is another characteristic of inflammation. Because the epidermis does not have any blood vessels, you can't really have a epidermatitis, if you will. Okay? The dermis has lots of blood vessels, and so it can undergo dermatitis. The last layer of the skin that we'll talk about is the subcutaneous layer. This is not considered one of the primary layers to skin, so it's considered a secondary layer. It's also known as the superficial fascia or the hypodermis. So it's found deep to the dermis. It contains mostly adipose tissue, so lots of fat tissue. It lacks any significant accessory structures. It lacks any organs, really. The only thing that you find in there besides fat, really, is blood vessels. So it's fat and blood vessels. It is of clinical significance, though. Maybe you've heard of a type of needle called a hypodermic needle. So a hypodermic needle is a little short needle that is used to make injections into the hypodermis of the skin. An example of a common hypodermic injection would be an insulin injection. So different drugs will be injected into different areas of the body for different reasons. You can inject something into the hypodermis of the skin or into a muscle. Into a muscle, that would be an intramuscular injection. And so the subcutaneous layer is a common site for injections.